the cure that was rotting in the kitchen. At some point around 1550 BC, an Egyptian healer looked at an open, infected wound, looked at the piece of bread that had been sitting in the corner going green for 3 days, and thought, those two should meet. We don't know their name. We don't know what made them try it. Maybe desperation, maybe curiosity, maybe the bread was just there, and the wound was just there, and something clicked. Maybe someone had a very bad day and thought, well, it can't make things worse. And then it made things better, which must have been a surprise to everyone involved, including the patient. What we know is that it worked, so they told someone, that someone told someone else. And for the next 3,500 years, the knowledge passed from healer to healer, culture to culture, continent to continent. Until 1928, when a Scottish bacteriologist named Alexander Fleming forgot to put a lid on a petri dish and got a Nobel Prize for the same idea. The Egyptian healer got nothing. To be fair, they had also been dead for 3,000 years, so the ceremony would have been awkward. This is that story. Here's the thing about infection that nobody liked to talk about. For most of human history, it killed more soldiers than the actual fighting did. You could survive a sword through the shoulder, annoying too, you could survive a spear to the leg. Then you'd spend the next 2 weeks dying slowly in a tent from what got into the hole the spear left behind. Armies knew this. They just didn't have a good answer. Egypt did, not because Egyptians were magical, not because they had some secret knowledge the rest of the world lacked, but because the Nile Valley is hot, humid, and absolutely terrible at keeping bread fresh. Bread went stale in a day, mold grew on everything, and at some point, enough healers noticed that wounds treated with that mold healed better than wounds that weren't, and they started writing it down. The prescription is exactly what you'd expect from people who had no idea why it worked. Take moldy bread, apply to wound, hope for the best. No theory, no explanation, just, we tried this, the patient lived, try this. That's it, that's the whole medical reasoning, and it was right. Now, to be fair, it didn't always work. Bread mold comes in a lot of varieties, and not all of them are the kind that fights infection. Egyptian healers were essentially running a lottery every time they reached for the bread bin. But they ran that lottery long enough that the treatments which worked got remembered, passed down, and eventually written into medical texts that have survived 3,500 years. The one that matters is the Ebers Papyrus, 110 pages of Egyptian medical knowledge, including, right there on the page, the instruction to press moldy bread into infected wounds. Nobody wrote down why. They didn't know why. It worked, and that was the whole point. Here's the part that makes this weirder. Egypt isn't special. Egypt just wrote it down first. Because on the other side of the world, people were doing the same thing, without the papyrus, without the Nile, without any contact with Egypt whatsoever. In Central Asia, healers were packing wounds with a paste made from moldy barley and apple. In Australia, Aboriginal healers were scraping mold off eucalyptus bark and pressing it into cuts. In 17th century Poland, someone had the inspired idea of mixing wet bread with spider webs. The webs stopped the bleeding, the mold handled the infection, and nobody asked too many questions. In Rome, a physician named Galen spent 4 years as the official doctor for the gladiators at Pergamon. His patients were men whose job was to get seriously injured on a regular basis and then show up for work again. He treated their wounds with moldy bread poultices. He wrote that the wounds he led cleanly. He moved on. There were more patients. For Australia, Central Asia, Rome, Poland, no shared language, no trade route, no ancient group chat. All of them landed on, put the rotten thing in the wound. The reason it worked, and this is the part where the science finally shows up, is that bread mold is often a species called Penicillium. Penicillium produces a compound that punches holes in bacterial cell walls until the bacteria fall apart. The healers didn't know about bacteria, they didn't know about cell walls, they just knew that the green fuzzy bread did something the clean bread didn't. Honestly, that's enough. You don't need to understand how a hammer works to hit something with it. The caveat, since we're being honest, not every bread mold is Penicillium. Ancient healers had no way to know the difference. They kept doing it because, on balance, it worked more than it didn't. Which is, if we're being generous, not too far from how modern medicine operates either. Then Europe had a new idea. Forget the mold, forget the observation, forget the 3,000 years of evidence. The correct treatment for infection, European medicine decided, was to drain the patient's blood until they felt better. Or died, whichever came first. For about 1,000 years, European medicine's solution to infection was bloodletting. The idea was that illness came from an imbalance of fluids, and removing a significant portion of those fluids would restore balance. If the patient got worse, you bled them more. If the patient died, you had perhaps bled them slightly too much. The theory was adjusted accordingly. In the meantime, village healers kept using mold, not because they understood it, because it worked. Quietly, without anyone's approval, in places where the trained physicians weren't paying attention. The practical knowledge that Egypt had written down 3,000 years earlier just kept going. The American Civil War ended in 1865. More soldiers died from infected wounds than from direct combat, by a ratio of roughly 2 to 1. By 1918, medicine had improved enough to narrow that gap, but only barely. The answer was still sitting there, going green in the corner, waiting to be taken seriously. Then in September 1928, Alexander Fleming came back from a 2-week holiday to find that a mold had grown on an uncovered petri dish in his lab. The bacteria around it were dead. He had forgotten to put the lid on. Fleming spent the next several years studying the mold, Penicillium notatum, and what it produced. By the 1940s, mass-produced penicillin was saving soldiers' lives in the Second World War. By conservative estimates, it has since saved over 200 million lives. Fleming received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1945. His acceptance speech did not mention Egypt. The mold on Fleming's petri dish was Penicillium. The mold on Egyptian bread, given the right conditions, was almost certainly also Penicillium. The healer who pressed it into a wound in 1550 BC and the bacteriologist who forgot to cover his dish in 1928 were, chemically speaking, doing the same thing. One of them got a prize, the other got a page in a papyrus that nobody read for 2,000 years. The bread didn't care either way, it just kept doing what it always did.